I didn't shed a tear when my son-in-law raised my walker over his head and smashed it onto the floor like garbage. I didn't flinch when my own daughter, my only child, laughed. I just stood there, 71, with arthritis in my spine and 40 years of sacrifices under my belt, and realized I wasn't their mother anymore. I was a problem to manage. So I walked out, slowly, without help, and by the time they thought to come after what I'd built, I'd already made sure they'd never touch a single dime. We're about to begin, but if you'd like, share where you're joining from. It reminds me this story doesn't echo into silence, it lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe. The roast was dry, the wine too warm, and the silence at the table had a shape to it, thick, wide, like a wall no one wanted to climb. Helen Marsh sat at the far end of the dining table, her back straight despite the ache it brought, her hands steady as she sliced through the leathery piece of meat on her plate. She wore a navy blouse with pearl buttons, and though the room was warm, she hadn't taken off her cardigan. Across from her, Claire poked at a wilted salad, her expression neutral but sharp around the eyes. Mark sat at the head of the table, legs spread, his fork abandoned, a second beer already sweating into a ring on the polished wood. Sophie sat quietly next to Helen, chewing carefully, glancing between the three adults like someone listening for distant thunder. I was thinking, Mark said, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand instead of the napkin. Maybe it's time we had a talk about planning. Claire didn't look up, but a small smile touched the corner of her mouth. Helen finished her bite, dabbed at her lips with the linen napkin, and looked toward him. Planning for what? Claire answered instead. The future, Mom. I mean, you're 71 now. Things change. You live alone. That house isn't exactly designed for someone with mobility issues. Helen raised one eyebrow. That house was designed by your father's hands. Every railing, every ramp. It's safer than most of the condos in your neighborhood. Mark laughed, short and humorless. Come on, Helen. No need to get defensive. We're just saying there are better uses for that property. Safer living arrangements. Maybe even a facility. Sophie stiffened in her seat. She's not going to a facility. Claire finally put her fork down. Sophie, stay out of this. It's not about being cruel. It's about being realistic. Helen placed her utensils down gently, folding her hands in her lap. Is this dinner or an ambush? Mark shrugged. You don't have to make it ugly. Don't I? You've got the house, the pension, the savings account, Claire said, her voice growing sharper. You're sitting on a pile of resources while we struggle to keep up with property taxes and tuition bills. If you're not going to help, at least don't make it harder. Helen looked at her daughter, her expression unreadable. I paid your tuition, twice. When you dropped out of business school the first time, and again when you went back. I helped with the down payment on this house, and when you needed a car after the accident, I co-signed. That was years ago. I remember it like it was yesterday. Mark pushed his chair back with a loud scrape. Jesus, here we go again with the guilt trip. He stood, walked toward the entryway, and pointed to Helen's walker, leaning silently against the wall. Maybe you should be grateful we even invite you here, instead of having to wheel you around like luggage. Before anyone could react, he grabbed the walker with both hands and raised it above his head. In one violent motion, he brought it down hard against the tile floor. The sound metal hitting ceramic rang out through the room, clean and brutal. The walker buckled and twisted, collapsing into itself with a screech and a final snapping crack. Sophie's chair scraped backward. What the hell is wrong with you? Mark stepped back, chest rising and falling. It was in the damn way. Claire watched the wreckage on the floor, then looked at Helen. Maybe now you'll learn not to lean on people. Helen didn't move. Her knuckles were pale against the edge of the table, but her voice, when she spoke, was steady and low. You're right. I leaned too long. Sophie moved quickly, taking her grandmother's arm. Come on, we're leaving. Helen rose slowly, tall in the silence that followed. As she passed the shattered walker, she didn't look at it once. Her eyes stayed fixed ahead, chin high, as if stepping across the ruins of something already dead. Behind them, no one spoke again until the door closed softly. The rhythmic whir of the scanner filled Helen's small study like a metronome, keeping time with her thoughts. Night had settled over Dallas, pressing against the window panes with a quiet heaviness. A single desk lamp cast a golden pool of light over the piles of paper that covered the mahogany surface. Deeds, statements, letters, receipts. Everything that mattered was now out of drawers, out of folders, out of hiding. Helen reached for the next envelope, her fingers moving with a steadiness that defied the tremble in her jaw. She unfolded a tax document from 1989, marked with her late husband's tidy handwriting. Beside her, Sophie sat cross-legged on the floor, her laptop open, a portable scanner humming between them. She wore an oversized hoodie and had tied her hair into a quick bun. Eyes darting between documents and digital folders with practiced ease. "You're more organized than most accountants," Sophie said softly, holding up a manila folder labeled Claire, tuition, room and board. Helen didn't answer immediately. She took off her glasses and cleaned them with the hem of her cardigan. "I kept records because they were the only things that couldn't talk back." Sophie glanced up. "That bad?" Helen smiled faintly, but her eyes didn't soften. "There's a difference between silence and peace. That house gave me peace. Those dinners." She trailed off and shook her head. "Let's just keep going." Sophie scanned the tuition receipts one by one. "You covered her first 3 years," she murmured, eyes widening. "Wait, there's more. 2 semesters at Wharton, and community college before that. She dropped out, then went back, then changed majors. I co-signed every time." Helen opened a photo envelope next and slid out a stack of faded prints. A younger version of her husband knelt beside the frame of their home, drill in hand, sweat soaking through the back of his t-shirt. In another, he stood on the porch with a hammer slung over his shoulder and pride in his eyes. "He built that ramp when Claire was pregnant," Helen said quietly. "She insisted she'd never bring a baby into that house unless it had modern touches. So he worked weekends, upgraded every room, even refinished the floors. I told him she'd never appreciate it." "Did she?" Sophie asked. "No," Helen said, placing the photo face down. From the bottom of a drawer, Helen pulled out a bundle of old letters, each bound with a blue ribbon. The paper was brittle at the edges, the ink faded. Sophie recognized her mother's handwriting on some of the envelopes, younger and more hopeful. Helen handed one over. "She asked for help every time something in her life didn't work out. Rent, job losses, credit card debt. And I helped every time. She never once said thank you, just moved on to the next crisis." Sophie read in silence, the words from her mother's past strangely hollow. "So, are you really going to cut them out?" Helen didn't look at her. She reached for the final envelope, one labeled simply Healthcare Proxy. As she opened it, her voice came low and steady. "They cut themselves out tonight." The scanner beeped again, finishing its pass. The law office smelled faintly of old books and leather, an intentional detail, Helen suspected. Nothing said competence like mahogany shelves and the quiet creak of a 100-year-old floorboard. She sat in a deep armchair across from a desk larger than most dinner tables, her hands folded neatly over a leather folio she had carried in like a weapon. Thomas Reed entered without fanfare, sleeves rolled, tie loosened, and a cup of coffee in each hand. He looked more like a man who had just returned from court than one expecting a 9 a.m. appointment. "Mrs. Marsh," he said, setting a mug beside her. "I read your message. Didn't expect it to be urgent. Then I saw the photos." Helen opened the folio with a deliberate slowness, as if revealing something sacred. Inside were dividers marked with crisp handwriting, deeds, beneficiaries, banking, Claire. Thomas took one glance at the organization and raised an eyebrow. "You ran a library, didn't you?" 32 years, Helen replied. He pulled over the will and estate section and began flipping through. After a moment, he let out a quiet whistle. "You're not just prepared, you're surgical." Helen sat still, her voice level. They think I'm a liability, that I've lived too long and cost them too much. Children? One daughter, and a son-in-law who broke my walker in front of me last night. Thomas stopped turning pages. Say that again? She leaned forward, her expression hardening. They invited me to dinner, ambushed me about my estate, accused me of hoarding. Then Mark, he grabbed the walker I used to stay upright and smashed it on the floor. My daughter laughed. My granddaughter walked me out. Thomas didn't speak for a moment. He just nodded once, slowly, and resumed flipping. You want to disinherit them. I want to make sure they get nothing, she said, her voice sharpening. No loopholes, no contests. No lawyer telling them they're still entitled to something. I don't want this to be messy. I want it to be permanent. He smirked faintly, the kind of expression people wore when a chess move had been decided 3 turns ago. We can do far better than cutting them out. We make a living trust. Name your granddaughter as sole beneficiary. I act as interim trustee until she turns 25. We add restrictive covenants, specific language about behavior, contact, even litigation. Any attempt to challenge the documents voids their standing. Helen watched him closely. And you're confident this will hold up? I've beaten trust challenges from angrier children than yours, he said. But know this, if we go forward, they'll fight it. They'll scream elder abuse, coercion, undue influence, especially if Sophie's involved. She was there when it happened. She has no idea I'm meeting you today. Thomas nodded approvingly. Good. We'll keep her out of it for now. The less she's tangled in the paper trail, the cleaner it stays. He pulled a blank form from his drawer and clicked his pen open. I'll need your signature on several things. Then I'll begin drafting. But I'll warn you, this won't be quiet. Once it's filed, they'll know something's changed. Helen didn't flinch. Let them. You're declaring legal war on your own daughter. Helen reached into the folio and removed a photo, her late husband standing beside the porch he built, smiling beneath a halo of sawdust and sweat. She placed it gently on the desk between them. They declared war the second they laughed at what I need to stand. Thomas held her gaze. Then we prepare accordingly. She nodded. We fight with paper and ink. The knock came just after 3, sharp and too fast to be neighborly. Helen didn't flinch. She had seen the black SUV crawl past her street twice that morning, once even pausing at the end of her driveway. Now, standing behind the screen door in the humid Texas afternoon, she took a breath before unlocking it. Claire stepped in first, heels clicking across the old hardwood like she owned the place. Her hair was tied back too tightly, her smile even tighter. Mark followed behind her, slower, arms crossed, wearing mirrored sunglasses that stayed on even as they entered the living room. We were just in the area, Claire said breezily, as if the dinner 2 nights ago hadn't ended with violence and humiliation. Thought we'd check on you, see how you're holding up. Helen gave a thin smile and gestured toward the sofa. I'm holding up fine, and I wasn't aware we were back on drop-ins. Mark chuckled, but it was humorless. He stayed standing, pacing the living room slowly, as if examining the place for loose change or unguarded documents. Looks the same as always, he muttered. Little dusty, maybe. Helen watched him but didn't respond. She moved to her armchair by the window and sat slowly and deliberately, setting her phone, screen down, on the side table where her late husband's reading lamp still stood. Claire sat across from her, crossing her legs. Let's just be honest, Mom. There's been some confusion about your finances, your will. It's not just us wondering. It's mostly just you, Helen said evenly. Claire leaned forward, her voice sharper now. After everything we've done for you, you really think it's fair to cut us out of the conversation? You owe us the truth. Owe you? Helen repeated, as if tasting the word for the first time. I don't recall borrowing anything. Mark moved closer to the fireplace, where a few framed photographs sat. Sophie's high school graduation, Helen and her husband at the lake, a black and white snapshot of Claire as a toddler. He picked one up, turned it over, then set it back down harder than necessary. You're not going to leave everything to that girl, he muttered. We're your family, not her. Helen kept her gaze on Claire. She is my family. And she doesn't ask what she's owed. She just shows up. Claire's face twisted. You're not thinking straight. This spiteful act, it's not you. Mark turned now, voice rising. And let me say this plain. If we find out you're messing with the paperwork, changing things behind our backs, you'll regret it. Helen calmly reached for the phone beside her and tapped the screen once. The soft red glow of the voice recorder confirmed it had been running since the moment they walked in. You're threatening me in my own home, she said quietly. Claire's face paled. You recorded us? Of course I did, Helen replied. Because I've learned, when someone shows you who they are, you hit record. Mark stepped forward, but she raised a hand, not afraid, but commanding. Try it. You'll just confirm what's already on file. At that moment, Sophie appeared in the hallway behind them, unnoticed until now. She didn't say a word, just held up her phone and tapped the screen. The audio file was already uploading. Claire stood abruptly. This is sick. You're letting her poison you against your own daughter. No, Helen said softly, rising with dignity. You did that all by yourself. Mark stared at them both, nostrils flaring, then turned and stormed toward the front door. Claire followed, her steps uneven now, heels catching on the rug. As the door slammed behind them, Sophie walked to Helen's side and showed her the message on the screen. Audio sent to Thomas Reed. Thomas had cleared his schedule for her. Helen sat in the same leather chair she'd occupied days earlier. Only this time the folio lay open and emptied on the desk, its contents now transformed into formal documents, clean margins, blue signatures, and embossed seals. A neat stack of paperwork waited before her, corner clipped and tabbed. The sun through the tall window lit the mahogany room in gold, but Helen didn't seem to notice it. Her eyes were fixed on the signature line halfway down the page. Thomas stood behind his desk, pen in hand, sleeves rolled once again. His jacket hung neatly on the coat stand beside the bookshelf. He spoke with the calm assurance of a man who knew every line of every paragraph. You've reviewed everything? I've read wills for people who couldn't read menus, Helen replied. Yes, I've reviewed it. He offered her the pen. Helen took it without hesitation. Her hand trembled only slightly as she wrote her name with careful loops and crisp clarity. One page, then the next. Thomas flipped each over as she completed them, watching the process with the vigilance of a surgeon. Initial there and here. One more time by the trust terms, he said. This one disinherits Claire and Mark entirely. This one confirms Sophie as sole beneficiary, with no interim access, just trusteeship oversight, mine, until she turns 25. Helen nodded, signing. She'll have earned it by then. She's not looking for shortcuts. Smart, Thomas said. And this, he tapped the next sheet, adds a charitable clause. A portion goes to the Dallas Historical Society in your name, publicly filed. Adds a bit of reputational shine to the whole thing. Helen allowed a small smile. My husband always wanted our story remembered. That house was our beginning. And this, Thomas said, lifting the final document, is the no contest clause. Ironclad. If Claire or Mark so much as raise a finger legally, they lose what little fallback they might have had. No appeals, no standing, no leverage. He placed it gently in front of her. Helen signed it, last. When the pen left the page, she sat back slowly and let out a long breath, one that seemed to empty more than just her lungs. She stared down at the table for a moment, then looked up at Thomas. They own nothing of me now, Thomas nodded. Legally and permanently. She pressed a hand to her chest, just above her heart, as if feeling for something no one else could see. You said they'd come after me. They will. I want them to. Thomas opened a drawer, retrieved a stamped envelope, and slid it into the outbox tray with the rest. I'm filing copies with the county clerk this afternoon. By the time they realize what's happened, the ink will be dry and the paper unmovable. Helen rose to her feet and reached for her purse. Thank you, Mr. Reed. He smiled faintly. Call me Thomas. No point in being formal now. We're co-conspirators. At the door, she paused. The sunlight framed her like a portrait, steel gray hair, upright shoulders, the quiet dignity of someone reclaiming not just property, but identity. Next time they come for me, she said, they won't find the same woman waiting. She stepped out, cane in hand, but steadier than ever. Back inside, Thomas reached for the phone on his desk. He tapped Sophie's number from the intake sheet and hesitated before pressing call. The first decline came at the grocery store. Mark stood at the self-checkout. A 12-pack of beer and a frozen lasagna already scanned, card in hand. The machine beeped twice before flashing the red message across the screen. Card declined. Please insert another payment method. He scowled, pulled the card out and tried again, slower this time. Same message, same beep. Try swiping the chip, a teenage clerk offered from behind him. Mark didn't turn. He yanked another card from his wallet, a joint account, the one Claire insisted they keep for security. But the moment he pressed it into the reader, the same cold message greeted him. Again and again. By the time he stalked out of the store, groceries abandoned at the kiosk, his face was red with rage. Back home, Claire sat at the kitchen table with 3 open envelopes in front of her, all of them marked with late fees. She had been on hold with the bank for 20 minutes before slamming the phone down. She changed the account routing, she snapped the moment Mark walked in. Everything's locked. The trust. The emergency fund? Gone. Mark didn't answer. He slammed his keys on the counter and pulled a beer from the back of the fridge, nearly tearing the tab off the can. I told you this would happen, Claire said, rising. You broke that walker and she didn't flinch. She's not playing games anymore. She can't just cut us off like that, Claire laughed bitterly. She just did. The next morning, they were on Helen's porch. No call, no warning, just a fist pounding against the screen door hard enough to shake the frame. Helen stood inside, unmoved. She opened the door without a greeting. Claire didn't wait. You've ruined us. I ended your assumption, Helen replied calmly. We have bills, property taxes, tuition for Sophie. Sophie pays her own tuition now. Claire flinched, caught off guard. Don't play superior. This is vindictive. You're trying to humiliate us. No, Helen said, her voice low and unshaken. Humiliation is what you did when you laughed as your husband destroyed what kept me standing. What you're feeling now, that's just consequence. Mark stepped forward, his voice louder than necessary. You think this makes you strong? Cutting off your own family? What kind of mother are you? Helen met his eyes squarely. I gave you decades. You gave me laughter at my pain. You think the math favors you? Mark's fists clenched, jaw tight. You'll regret this. Sophie appeared behind Helen, slipping onto the porch without a word. She didn't speak until she stood beside her grandmother. She doesn't owe you anything, Sophie said. Not anymore, not ever. Claire's lip curled. This little brat is poisoning you. She's protecting me, Helen replied. Something you've never bothered to do. Mark exploded. You think you've won? You think we'll just walk away broke while you pass everything to her? He stepped off the porch and shouted back toward the door, loud enough for the entire street to hear. You don't get to shut us out. You hear me, you bitter old witch? The neighbor across the street peeked through their curtains. Another, watering a hedge, stopped mid-motion. Helen didn't flinch. She pulled out her phone, thumb already on the record button. Keep going, Mark, she said. Let the neighborhood hear you the way I've heard you for years. Claire tugged at his arm. Let's go. This is a trap. Sophie reached for Helen's hand as the SUV peeled off, tires kicking up dust from the curb. Inside, Helen emailed the audio file to Thomas before the door had even clicked shut. The courtroom was cold and impersonal, all steel edges and fluorescent light. Still, Helen sat straight-backed at the petitioner's table, her hands resting lightly on a leather portfolio. She wore a gray blouse with pearl earrings, Nothing ostentatious, but deliberate, controlled, unshakable. Across the aisle, Claire sat stiffly in a dark pantsuit, lips pursed, jaw tight. Her lawyer whispered something to her, but she didn't respond. Mark sat behind her, arms folded, tapping his foot as if the courtroom were wasting his time. The bailiff called the case number. The judge, a middle-aged woman with a judicial calm that bordered on exhaustion, peered down from the bench. This is a petition to challenge the validity of the living trust of Mrs. Helen Marsh, filed by Claire Marsh Whitman and Mark Whitman. Grounds: mental incompetence, undue influence, and elder coercion. Let's proceed. Claire stood first. She cleared her throat and stepped forward like someone about to recite a memorized speech. Your Honor, we believe my mother is no longer in full command of her faculties. Her recent decisions have been erratic, sudden. We're concerned she's being manipulated, specifically by my daughter. Helen didn't react. She kept her eyes on the judge, unmoved. Claire's voice softened. Rehearsed. My mother is 71. She lives alone. She's isolated. She doesn't have the mental clarity to make sweeping financial decisions like this. Sophie's been influencing her, pushing her to cut us out. It's not her fault. She's just confused. Mark stood when his name was called to testify, walking to the stand with performative exhaustion. Look, I know how this sounds, he said, voice dipped in artificial humility. But she's frail. She can't get around without help. She was never a tough lady to begin with. And now she's turned cold. Sophie's been whispering in her ear ever since college. Thomas didn't even bother standing to object. He waited. Then, when the judge turned to him, he rose with the smoothness of someone who had done this many times before. Your Honor, we anticipated this filing and are prepared to address all points. He approached the bench with a folder, handed it to the clerk, and stepped back. You'll find notarized medical evaluations from Dr. Eleanor Sharp and Dr. Brian Klein, both licensed in geriatric cognitive health. Both attest Mrs. Marsh is in full command of her decision-making abilities. The judge flipped through the top sheet. Recent. Dated within the month. Thomas turned toward the gallery. I'd also like to submit Exhibit D, an audio recording, time-stamped and geotagged, taken inside Mrs. Marsh's home during an uninvited visit by the petitioners. He pressed play. Claire's voice filled the courtroom. After everything we've done for you, you owe us the truth. Then Mark, you think this makes you strong. What kind of mother are you? Then Helen, quiet but steady, I gave you decades. You gave me laughter at my pain. Then the sound of Mark shouting on the porch, you bitter old witch. The judge raised one eyebrow and paused the audio herself. This, she said slowly, does not sound like caretakers expressing concern. This sounds like coercion in reverse. Claire's mouth parted, but no sound came out. Her lawyer leaned in, whispering frantically, but she ignored him. She looked dazed, as if the floor beneath her had just tilted. Helen remained silent until the judge looked to her directly. Mrs. Marsh, do you feel you've been pressured by your granddaughter? Helen met the judge's eyes. No, Your Honor. Sophie didn't ask for anything. She listened. Claire stood suddenly, her voice cracking. She's lying. She doesn't know what she's saying. This isn't her, it's that girl. Sophie's playing her. The judge tapped her gavel lightly. Mrs. Whitman, please return to your seat. Sophie leaned in close to her grandmother, her voice barely above a whisper. You're doing perfect, Grandma. They're unraveling themselves. Helen didn't respond, but her hand rested gently over Sophie's. Mark buried his face in his hands, mumbling something too low to hear. Claire sat frozen, as if all the air had drained from the room. By Monday morning, the calls started. First, it was Cousin Cheryl from Lubbock, who hadn't visited in years, but always remembered to send a Christmas card. Then came Uncle Jim, who sounded like he was reading from a script someone else had written. Each call followed the same rhythm. Warm concern, a pause, then an anxious question wrapped in sugary pity. Hey, Helen, we just wanted to check in. Claire said you've been not quite yourself lately. Helen listened. her face unreadable as she sat in her small breakfast nook with her coffee cooling beside her. She made no effort to defend herself. Instead, she nodded, asked about Cheryl's grandchildren, then hung up gently. By noon, the damage was wider. Claire had made the rounds, calls to family, Facebook messages to mutual friends, even a vaguely written status. When someone you love starts acting like a stranger, all you can do is pray they find their way back to the truth. Family first. It wasn't just manipulation, it was theater, and Mark, never one to be subtle, followed with a post of his own. Elder abuse isn't always physical. Sometimes it's psychological. Watch your loved ones, folks. Sometimes the wolves wear college sweatshirts and call you grandma. Sophie showed Helen the post that evening. Do we respond? No, Helen said, standing slowly. We invite. Sophie blinked. Invite who? Helen turned toward the study. Everyone watching. That Friday, Helen prepared dinner. She didn't cook often anymore. Arthritis made peeling and chopping harder, but she took her time. Sophie helped with the heavier lifting. Roasting vegetables, setting out the good china, lighting vanilla candles Helen had saved for non-existent guests. The bungalow smelled of rosemary and garlic, warm and nostalgic. By 6 o'clock, they had a full house. Cousin Cheryl, Uncle Jim, a second cousin Helen barely remembered, even her sister-in-law Gloria, who hadn't been south of Missouri since her husband's funeral. They came curious, tense, glancing toward each other as they filtered into the living room. Claire had made sure they came expecting an intervention, but what they got was a presentation. Helen stood beside her old oak desk, which now bore 5 neatly arranged binders. She spoke with the calm cadence of a woman used to reading aloud. Thank you for coming. I know some of you were told I was confused, that I've lost my grip. So tonight, I'd like to show you what I've actually been doing. Sophie remained in the background, phone steady in her hand, quietly recording. Helen opened the first binder, labeled Deeds and Titles, and walked them through the home ownership history, her original mortgage papers, and the final paid-off statement. The next binder held tuition receipts, signed checks, and emails, confirming Claire's repeated requests for financial help. The third, marked correspondence, contained handwritten letters. Helen read one aloud. Claire, age 24, asking for help after a failed business partnership, promising it would be the last time. No one interrupted. Even the fourth binder, medical and legal, was received in silence. It contained physician statements, legal filings, and a notarized affidavit from Thomas Reed, summarizing her mental fitness and the legality of the trust. The final binder, marked simply Legacy, held a single photo of Helen and her husband standing on their porch, arms around each other, proud and unaware of what the years ahead would bring. When Helen finished, she sat down slowly. I'm not asking you to pick sides, she said. But if you're going to judge me, I want you to have the full picture, not the one Claire painted with rumors. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the hum of the air conditioner. Cheryl cleared her throat. She said you didn't remember our last phone call. Helen smiled gently. I remember you told me your grandson likes astronomy, and that you were worried about your hip surgery this fall. Cheryl's eyes welled. Gloria leaned forward. I want copies of those binders. Behind the camera, Sophie pressed stop. The appellate courtroom was sleeker than the county chamber. More glass, less wood, and a whole lot less patience. Claire adjusted her blazer as she sat beside her new attorney, a young, sharp-jawed man who had promised to pivot the narrative. She'd traded subtlety for litigation, charm for strategy. Mark sat 2 rows behind, arms crossed, barely disguising his contempt. On the other side of the room, Helen sat flanked by Thomas and Sophie. Unlike the initial hearing, Sophie had been formally added to the proceedings. She wore a navy blouse, her hair pinned back, face unreadable. Helen sat tall in a charcoal gray dress, composed but not distant. This time, she wasn't defending herself. She was waiting. The panel of appellate judges entered, 3 of them black robes brushing the floor in unison. They didn't smile, they didn't fidget, and they didn't waste time. Claire's attorney stood first. Your Honors, we assert that Mrs. Helen Marsh was unduly influenced by her granddaughter, Sophie Marsh. There is compelling reason to believe Sophie manipulated her grandmother into altering long-standing estate plans for personal gain, all while isolating her from her rightful family. Thomas rose next, slow and deliberate, and took his place behind the podium. Your Honors, we anticipated this argument. It is not only inaccurate, it is insulting. As Exhibit A, we've submitted Sophie Marsh's financial records for the last 5 years, including her college bank statements, tuition payments, and work history. She has never received, accessed, or transferred a single dollar from any of Helen Marsh's accounts. He handed off a slim folder to the clerk. Her income has remained consistent with a part-time campus employee. No unexplained deposits, no sudden purchases, no gifts or transfers. The judge on the left flipped through the first few pages, eyebrows twitching slightly. And this was notarized by a third-party forensic accountant. Yes, Thomas replied. Exhibit B confirms as much. Claire squirmed in her chair, whispering urgently to her attorney. The middle judge looked up. What about Mrs. Marsh's mental capacity at the time of the trust's execution? Thomas didn't miss a beat. Exhibit C is a notarized statement from Dr. Eleanor Sharp, as well as a supplemental neurological exam conducted 2 weeks after the original filing. Both reports confirm Mrs. Marsh is cognitively fit, capable of independent decision-making, and has full understanding of the legal actions she undertook. Then came the pause. Thomas stepped back. And finally, Your Honors, Exhibit D. The courtroom lights dimmed slightly as the clerk queued up the video on the large screen at the front. The audio filled the space. Mark's voice blared. Maybe you should be grateful we even invite you here, instead of having to wheel you around like luggage. Then the violent crack of aluminum on tile, the sound of Helen's walker shattering. Claire's laughter followed, too loud, too sharp, too damning. A moment passed, then another. The rightmost judge leaned forward slightly. Is this time-stamped? Yes, Thomas said. Taken 2 days before the trust was signed. Provided by both Mrs. Marsh and Ms. Marsh independently. Claire's face drained, her complexion blanching under the cold fluorescent lights. The judge leaned back in her chair, her tone clipped. We've reviewed all submissions. The court finds no basis for the appeal. Allegations of manipulation are unsupported, and claims of mental incompetence are refuted by medical and forensic documentation. She looked over her glasses at Claire. Appeal is dismissed. With prejudice. Claire's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Mark stood abruptly. This is a setup. They had this planned from day one. The gavel struck once. This courtroom is adjourned. Claire turned to her attorney. We can challenge that ruling, right? He didn't answer. Behind her, Sophie exhaled quietly and squeezed Helen's hand. Are you okay? She asked. Helen gave a faint smile. I've been okay since the moment I stopped apologizing. Outside the courtroom, reporters were waiting. Not many, but enough. And in Thomas's briefcase, another binder, unopened. The paper landed with a soft thump on Helen's porch. Sophie had already brewed the coffee, but it was the headline that made her stop mid-pour. Elderly widow outsmarts greedy daughter and son-in-law. Dallas County Appeals Court upholds. Ironclad trust beneath it. A photo stretched across the width of the fold. Helen and Sophie standing side by side in front of the Dallas Historical Society building. Helen held the ceremonial check, but it was Sophie's hand on her grandmother's back. Gentle, proud, that made the image stick. Helen stepped out into the warm morning air and picked up the paper. She didn't need to read it. She already knew how it would be framed, how people would devour the easy narrative of betrayal, revenge, and courtroom drama. The press loved symmetry. Widow versus daughter. Loyalty versus entitlement. It made for a great story. Inside, Sophie was scanning the article with narrowed eyes. They used every quote from court, but nothing about the binders. And they cropped out Mark from the background of the photo. Helen chuckled quietly. He's lucky. He'd have broken the lens. The front yard looked different now, cleaner somehow. Neighbors waved more readily. Cars no longer slowed suspiciously but honked in brief bursts of support. A woman walking her dog gave Helen a thumbs up from the sidewalk. I didn't want headlines, Helen said softly, folding the paper. I just wanted peace. But sometimes truth makes noise, Sophie replied. You're showing people they don't have to take abuse, even if it's from family. Helen nodded, but her expression was distant, contemplative. That kind of courage costs something. Most people don't want to pay it. Behind them, her phone buzzed with notifications. Messages from former coworkers, local friends, even a librarian from Houston who had read the article online. Most were congratulatory. One simply said, "Wish I had done the same with my son-in-law. He took everything." Sophie scrolled through the comment section on the paper's Facebook page. People are picking sides. They always do, Helen said, but only after the dust has settled. Across town, in a much quieter kitchen, Claire slammed her phone on the counter. "Greedy daughter? Are you kidding me?" she hissed. That was a biased hit piece. They made me sound like I locked her in a closet and took her teeth out for inheritance. Mark didn't look up from the kitchen table. You laughed when I broke the walker. What did you think was going to happen? Claire spun toward him, eyes wild. You're blaming me now. I'm saying maybe next time you think about optics before smirking in court. She grabbed her laptop and yanked it open, fingers flying across the keyboard. She drafted a new post, long, all caps in parts, peppered with phrases like elder manipulation and trial by media. When she hit post, it went live with a photo of her and Mark holding their wedding rings in palm-to-palm defiance. 10 likes in an hour. Then 8 comments. 5 of them referenced the article. 3 told her to seek therapy. Claire closed the laptop with a sharp snap and reached for her wine glass. Back at the bungalow, Helen was ironing one of her husband's old shirts. Not to wear, just to smooth out the creases before she framed it. It had paint on the cuffs, specks from the day he redid the porch railing without telling her. Sophie leaned against the door frame. You know the newspaper's going to do a follow-up next week. They want quotes about the donation. I'll give them one, Helen said. Tell them this is what legacy looks like. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the flag on her porch. A neighbor's child rode past on a bike, helmet loose, streamers fluttering. Sophie stepped out to wave. Helen stayed inside, watching through the screen door, paper still folded neatly under her arm. The foyer of the Dallas Historical Society smelled faintly of lemon polish and old paper, a comforting blend Helen had always associated with memory, not nostalgia. Memory. Things preserved on purpose, cataloged, respected, not left to rot in forgotten drawers. She stood beneath a modest archway where a brass plaque had just been affixed to the wall. The Helen Marsh Community Literacy Room. In honor of a life of quiet service and relentless dignity. Helen blinked once. She wasn't one for public displays, not in the decades she'd worked behind the counter at the library, nor in the quiet evenings she spent preserving documents, while Sophie did her homework on the floor nearby. But this moment, this space, felt different. Earned. Solid. Sophie walked up beside her, carrying a clipboard in one hand and a small vase of white camellias in the other. The director says we had over 60 RSVPs. I set up chairs facing the podium, and the caterers just finished the fruit platters. Helen raised an eyebrow. Fruit platters? It's Texas, Sophie grinned. It's this or barbecue, and I didn't want to risk Aunt Gloria getting ribs on her white pants again. Helen shook her head, but the corner of her mouth lifted. Inside the room itself, modest, cozy, full of soft lighting and shelves already being filled. Volunteers were unpacking crates of donated books. There were dictionaries in 3 languages, YA novels, job prep manuals. A box labeled Helen's Picks sat by the door. Sophie had filled it with titles Helen once handed out at the library to anyone who looked a little lost. By mid-afternoon, the crowd had gathered. former co-workers, librarians from across the county, a few distant cousins who'd shown up quietly and respectfully this time, neighbors with handwritten notes tucked into their purses. One little girl, no more than 8, clutched a children's biography of Maya Angelou like it was a secret. Thomas stood near the back in a charcoal suit, arms crossed, gaze scanning everything. When the room hushed, he stepped up to the podium. "Thank you all for coming. Most of you know why you're here, to recognize Helen Marsh, not just for her generous donation, but for what that donation represents." He paused, glancing toward Helen. Some of us spend our lives building things other people try to take. But a few build quietly, piece by piece, and when they're finally seen, what they've built becomes undeniable. Applause rose, not thunderous, but steady, grounded. When Helen stepped to the podium, her fingers briefly brushed the engraved plaque beside it. She looked out over the faces, some familiar, some unexpected, none unwelcome. "I don't like speeches," she began, "but I've spent most of my life in rooms like this, rooms filled with books and questions and second chances. And if this space can give even one person what I didn't have, room to stand their ground, then that's enough for me." The applause came again, louder this time. Afterward, as people filtered toward the refreshments and Sophie handed out bookmarks with quotes from Helen's favorite authors, Thomas approached with a rare, small smile. "You did it," he said. "The legal dust has settled. There's nothing more for them to contest." Helen looked toward the window, where sunlight poured through the stained glass crest of the society's emblem. "It doesn't bring peace," she said, "but it makes space for it." Thomas nodded. "Sometimes that's all we get." As he turned to leave, Sophie joined her at the edge of the room. Her cheeks were pink with excitement, her eyes bright. "I talked to the director. They want to do a quarterly author spotlight under your name. They're thinking of calling it Stories from Helen." Helen smiled, genuinely this time. "Well, that sounds a bit sentimental." "Too late," Sophie teased. "You're already a symbol." Helen glanced around the room. People were reading, smiling, listening, no yelling, no accusations, just words and warmth. "I used to think I was just holding things together," she said. "But I think maybe I was building something after all." Sophie leaned against her shoulder. "And now it's standing on its own." The crowd began to sing an impromptu Happy Dedication Day, followed by the clink of glasses and laughter echoing down the marbled halls. But in the parking lot, parked just out of sight, an idling car waited with the engine running. Inside, Claire scrolled through the society's event page. Her thumb hovered over the RSVP list. The knock this time didn't come with force. It was almost timid, 2 soft raps on Helen's front door, followed by silence. No SUV idling in the driveway, no shouting, no bluster, just a hot, still afternoon, and the uneasy stillness of something rehearsed. Helen opened the door halfway, already knowing who would be on the other side. Claire stood there, makeup lightly done, hands clasped in front of her like a penitent parishioner. Mark lingered behind her, arms crossed, eyes already scanning the interior like he couldn't decide whether to play along or barge in. "Hi, Mom," Claire said, voice barely above a whisper. Helen didn't respond. "We just want a few minutes," Claire continued. "That's all." Helen stepped aside. Not because she was yielding, but because she had nothing left to defend. They entered the living room like strangers. Claire sat carefully on the edge of the couch. Mark stood stiffly near the fireplace, as if touching the furniture would cost him something. Helen remained by the window, watching them like portraits she no longer recognized. Claire inhaled sharply. "Mom, we're broke." Helen blinked, slow and unreadable. Claire's voice broke around the edges. "The accounts are drained. We fell behind on the mortgage. Mark's truck is up for repossession. We didn't plan for this. We thought—" "You assumed," Helen corrected. Claire swallowed. "We thought there'd be time, that this phase would pass." Helen walked to the mantel and adjusted a photo frame, not because it was crooked, but because she wanted to keep her hands from shaking. Mark finally spoke, his voice flat and simmering. You've made your point. But this, leaving us out completely, you'll regret that. Helen turned. No. What I regret is letting either of you believe that cruelty has no cost. Claire leaned forward, tears slipping down her cheek now. Please, we're your family. You were, Helen said. But family doesn't throw you away for being inconvenient. Silence thickened the room. Mark stepped toward the center of the room. You're choosing her. He gestured toward the hallway, where Sophie now stood silently, over your own blood. Sophie's voice was quiet but firm. She's not choosing, she's remembering. Helen looked at her granddaughter, then at Claire, then back to Mark. I gave you more than most mothers ever could. I gave you time, money, forgiveness. And when you laughed at my pain, I gave you one last chance. You used it to break what I relied on to stand. Claire's voice cracked again. We were angry. You were entitled, Helen said. Still are, Mark scoffed. This is ridiculous. You're going to die in this house surrounded by paperwork and secondhand furniture, and she'll sell it all the second you're gone. Sophie stepped forward. You don't know anything about me. I know an opportunist when I see one. Helen's hand lifted, palm up. Not to stop Sophie, but to steady her. I know what she is, Helen said. She's someone who stayed, who didn't ask for a dime, who carried boxes, scanned files, sat beside me in court, who made tea when my hands were too swollen to grip the kettle, who didn't call me crazy when I needed to scream. She turned to Claire, voice colder now. You want my forgiveness. But you don't even know what you did wrong. Claire rose. We just wanted to be part of your life. You were, Helen said, and you made it smaller. Mark walked toward the door, muttering something that didn't quite form words. Claire followed, pausing once before stepping outside. Mom, I'm sorry. Helen didn't respond. The door closed softly. Sophie walked to her side and took her hand. They stood like that for a moment, 2 generations connected by something deeper than revenge. Something quiet, steady, whole. Outside, the Whitman's car didn't leave right away. The engine turned, then idled, then turned off again. Helen pressed the final corner of tape against the back of the frame and stepped back. The letter inside wasn't long, maybe 10 lines in total, printed in thick pencil and uneven margins. The signature at the bottom was scrawled in green crayon, Danny, age 9. It had arrived 3 days after the dedication at the Historical Society, folded inside a manila envelope with no return address. Dear Miss Helen, thank you for the books and chairs, and for believing that kids like me can be something one day. I want to be a writer now. I didn't think I was allowed to before. Helen had read it once, then twice, then silently walked it to the frame shop herself. Now it hung on the wall across from her reading chair, between a black and white photo of her husband and a pressed flower Sophie had given her in 3rd grade. No degrees, no awards, just that letter, delicate, real, earned. Thomas arrived just after 10, holding a flat black binder in one hand and an envelope in the other. He didn't sit. I filed the final codicils, he said, placing the documents on the kitchen table. Claire and Mark are permanently removed from any lines of succession. The no contest clause held in appellate court. And per your request, I've added a clause that bars them from accessing even symbolic assets. No heirlooms, no mementos, not a cent. Helen nodded once, slowly. I've also updated the title transfer for the house, he added. Upon your passing, it goes directly into Sophie's name, bypassing probate completely. Helen looked toward the hallway where Sophie had hung her college acceptance letter. Good. Thomas opened the envelope and slid out a single page. This is the healthcare directive. We've added a protective clause. Sophie has full authority in the event of medical incapacitation. Claire and Mark cannot override or intervene. Even in emergency scenarios, Helen signed it in one stroke. When she handed the pen back, her fingers brushed the top of the paper, lingering for a breath too long. Not hesitating, just honoring. You've closed every door they might try to reopen, she said quietly. Thomas gave a small nod. You sealed it. I just nailed it shut. Sophie entered carrying a glass of iced tea, handing one to each of them before settling into the chair beside her grandmother. Her hair was still damp from her morning walk, her skin pink from the sun. You're officially bulletproof, she said with a grin. Helen smirked. More like lawsuit-proof. Sophie raised her glass. To your legacy. It's untouchable now. They clinked glasses gently. No ceremony, just acknowledgement. After Thomas left, Helen walked slowly through the house, barefoot on the cool hardwood. Every frame on the wall, every folded blanket on the couch, every well-worn rug, it all felt lighter. Not because anything had changed, but because nothing remained hanging in the air. No more threats. No more waiting. She returned to the reading room and sat, eyes drifting back to the framed letter. She stared at it for a long time, the corners of her mouth lifting with something more than pride. Sophie came in quietly and curled up on the floor beside her, like she had as a child, her laptop balanced on her knees, working through final exams. Helen reached out and laid a hand on Sophie's shoulder. You're safe now, even after I'm gone. I know, Sophie said, but so are you. They didn't speak for a while after that. The clock ticked. Sunlight stretched through the window and landed in golden squares on the floor. The house felt like it was breathing, slowly, peacefully, finally unburdened. Then, outside, a car door slammed. Helen didn't move. A pause. Then the sound of footsteps, heels, not rushed, but deliberate, coming up the walkway. Sophie sat up. Helen didn't look toward the door. She only whispered, "Let her knock." The soil was dry but forgiving. Helen pressed her gloved fingers into the earth, feeling the soft crumble of compost beneath the surface. She moved with care, more deliberate now than she used to be, but not frail, just precise. Her garden had always been modest. A rectangle of flower beds, flanked by rosemary bushes and 2 stubborn rose vines that refused to bloom on schedule. But today, it was thriving. She knelt slowly beside a row of young zinnias, adjusting the angle of a bamboo stake as the sun filtered through the oak tree overhead. The hum of cicadas filled the silence, not harsh, but steady, like a reminder that time was still passing and everything was still growing. From the porch behind her, Sophie's voice broke the quiet. You got another letter. Helen wiped her hands on her apron and turned. Sophie was sitting on the swing, legs curled beneath her, a stack of mail beside her. This one's from a girl named Elsie, Sophie said, unfolding the note. She's in the GED prep group. Want me to read it? Helen nodded once. Sophie cleared her throat, her voice warm. Dear Ms. Helen, I used to think I was dumb because I didn't learn how to read until I was almost 12. But now I come to the center twice a week and I don't feel stupid anymore. I feel ready. Thank you for helping people like me. I'm going to take my test this fall. Wish me luck. Helen smiled, soft and proud. I do. Sophie looked up. There are 3 more just like that in the pile. And one from a man in his 60s, who says the books helped him write his first resume. Helen leaned back against the garden bench, brushing a loose strand of hair from her forehead with the back of her glove. This, she said, looking out across the small yard, is family now, not the ones who shared my blood. The ones who share something better. Sophie tilted her head. What's that? Kindness, Helen said, and the decency not to laugh when someone is hurting. The air around them was still, but not heavy. No distant threats, no echoes of slammed doors, just birdsong, filtered sunlight, and the quiet scratch of Helen's trowel against the soil. Sophie stood, walked across the grass, and knelt beside her grandmother. Without a word, she wrapped her arms around Helen, gently, fully, with nothing held back. Helen leaned into it, her hands muddy, her back tired, but her heart steady. When they pulled apart, Sophie helped her to her feet. They walked back toward the house together, shoes brushing against dandelions, the screen door creaking open like it always had. Inside, Helen moved to the bookshelf. At the very bottom, behind the poetry volumes, was the last of her binders. She pulled it out. The label was clean. Legal, closed. She didn't open it. She just walked it to the hallway closet, tucked it between two photo albums, and shut the door with a final, quiet click. The past didn't vanish. It didn't need to, but it no longer lived in the center of the room. That afternoon, Sophie made lemonade while Helen set the table outside. They ate under the oak tree, beneath the fading light, each bite unhurried, each silence comfortable. And when the wind shifted, it didn't bring dread with it, only the scent of rosemary and a garden still blooming. The envelope was thick, off-white, and creased like it had been clutched too tightly on its way through the mail. Helen didn't need to read the return address. Claire's handwriting had always been performative, looped and feminine, like she was signing a thank you card, no matter the content. It sat on the kitchen counter for 2 full days before Helen touched it. Not out of temptation, just choice. She picked it up after breakfast, standing in the same place where, months ago, she'd first told Sophie the truth about the dinner that changed everything. No deep breath, no hesitation. Helen tore it in half with a single motion. Then again, crosswise. The paper crackled under her fingers, the contents forever unread. She opened the trash bin beneath the sink and dropped the pieces inside. They landed between a lemon rind and a receipt for new gardening gloves. Nothing special, nothing sacred. Sophie wandered in a few minutes later, phone in hand. "Was that from Claire?" Helen nodded. "You didn't read it?" "No," Helen said simply. "She had my attention for 71 years. She doesn't get another minute." Sophie smiled softly. "They got nothing, Grandma. Not even your time." Helen rinsed her hands in the sink. "That's the point." The house was quiet, but not hollow. Outside, a breeze rolled across the backyard, lifting the curtains just enough to carry in the scent of fresh soil and rosemary. From the hallway, a glint of brass caught her eye, the framed photograph of the literacy program plaque, hanging just beneath the thermostat. She walked over to it. The Helen Marsh Community Literacy Room. In honor of a life of quiet service and relentless dignity. Helen touched the frame lightly, fingertips grazing the glass. This was the inheritance, not cash, not furniture, but freedom, for Sophie, for the students, for herself. Behind her, Sophie settled onto the couch and opened her laptop. "There's a new testimonial," she said, "from someone who passed their GED this morning. They said they hadn't read a book all the way through since 7th grade. Now they're applying to community college." Helen smiled. "Let's print that one." "Already did." They shared a glance, simple, familiar, full of the kind of love that didn't demand to be proven. The rest of the morning passed quietly. Helen pruned the porch geraniums while Sophie updated the donation page. The sun filtered in through the windows just right, warm, not glaring, and the shadows didn't feel like warnings anymore. They felt like time passing. By noon, Helen sat down at her reading chair. The same place she had scanned documents, counted receipts, faced the truth. Now, it was just a chair again, no defense required. She looked around the room. Photos on the wall, Sophie's hoodie on the banister, the faint whistle of the kettle in the kitchen. This was hers, fully, without terms. She closed her eyes for a moment and let herself feel it. Not relief, exactly. Something better. Completion. Peace without apology. Sophie peeked around the corner. "Want some tea?" "Let's add honey this time." Sophie grinned. "Going soft." Helen raised an eyebrow. "Don't push it." Laughter drifted down the hallway, echoing off the wood floors. Clean, easy, light. And as Sophie disappeared into the kitchen, Helen leaned back and looked at the plaque one more time. Her voice came low and certain, meant for no one, yet meant for everyone. "My son-in-law smashed my walker on the floor, and my daughter laughed. So I took away everything they thought they'd inherit. And then, finally, she smiled.